Hello, this is a recording chiefly for the Suffolk Jungian Circle, which is meeting at the end of this month online as usual to discuss the topic of Jung and modernity. And as with these previous recordings I've made, and other people have made, if you're not a member of that circle, but you, by all means, if it's of interest to you, chip in a comment, leave your feedback. And if you would like to participate in the online discussion, just let me know and I'll send you the link. So in discussing Jung and modernity, obviously we need to start with a working definition of modernity, which is not an easy thing to do because politicians and historians and sociologists and various other people all have their own take. Each has a different argument as to quite when modernity started and quite when it ended. The majority are largely agreed that it has ended, and there was, for some people still is, a phase of post-modernity afterwards. But even there is disagreement in that some people argue post-modernity is dead in the water, it's over and done with, and other people say, oh no, it's still going on, we're still very much in a post-modernist era. So there's differing points of view. And if we try to incorporate every single differing point of view, we'll be here till Christmas just talking about that alone. So I'm going to opt for a definition of modernity, bearing in mind it's not the only one, which at least gives us a starting point for the online discussion. So Max Weber, sociologist, he argued a number of factors led to the development of modernity, and he characterises it in certain ways that I'll go over, which I think ally quite well with Jungian ideas and Jungian approaches, both in terms of things that Jung has contributed towards that overlap with modernity, but also where Jung has identified certain issues that Weber also identified as being problematic, concerns with modernity, and what can be done about those concerns, which is why I'm largely going down the line of Weber's argument rather than anybody else's, because it makes a nice, well, I think it does anyway, nice marry up between those ideas and Jung's ideas. So for Max Weber, modernity is something that gradually comes into existence with the birth of the Industrial Revolution. So as a whole variety of different very clever people developed industrial scale machinery that could do the job of 50, 100, however many individual human workers, a lot of those workers found themselves out of jobs. People who'd previously been farm labourers and old ladies spinning wool at home and that kind of thing suddenly found that they were being superseded by machines that could do their job 50 times quicker and for a fraction of the cost. And that led to a number of factors. So one of the factors, obviously in the short term, is mass unemployment and all of the anger and resentment and fear, a very genuine fear, people were starving to death, that came with mass unemployment. But also it led to a shift as people left the villages in which they'd been tilling the land and weaving wool and doing whatever else they'd been doing, and moved in search of work to towns and to cities. And what we see happen is a massive shift where something in the region of 80-ish% of the population had been living in villages pre-Industrial Revolution, and by the time we're 3/4 of the way through the Industrial Revolution, 80%-ish of the British population were living in big cities and in quite sizable towns. So going from a very rural way of life to a very urban way of life. And that becomes a key element for Weber and others in understanding what modernity is. The modern life is the city life, essentially, rather than the rural life. And even for those people who remain living in villages, they are being heavily impacted by the nature of urban existence. So one of the factors that changes here for Weber, and Marie-Louise von France also picks up on this and talks about it at some length, is the development of anonymity, essentially. That if we imagine a small village 300, 400 years ago, everybody knows each other. And I'm sure I say 300, 400 years ago, I'm sure there are villages exactly still like this today. everybody knows each other. Half of them are related to each other, and even the ones who aren't related, you know the names of practically everybody around you. You know who's married to who, and who's a child of who, and so on, who does what job. There is a network of knowledge and identity, and every single person in that village fits into it. Marie-Louise von France argues that there is also a network of care. She was sort of talking about, what back in the day would have been referred to rather unkindly as the village idiot. People with what we would now call learning difficulties, who these days often end up being institutionalised. Back in earlier times, and she's not even talking hundreds and hundreds of years ago, she's talking within the context of her own lifetime, that people would be looked after by the community. People would recognise their issues, whether it was a learning difficulty or maybe an elderly person who was getting dementia or something like that. People would recognise their problems and go to some lengths to accommodate them and look after them in the community, rather than carting them away to an institutionalised existence, which potentially does mean they might not have got the specialist help they could get within an institution, but also meant that they were cared for by people who had some warmth towards them, rather than being cared for by people who were being paid to look after them. And obviously you can still care about somebody you're paid to look after, but it's not quite the same thing, is it? As if it's a friend or a relative looking after you. So once population size gets bigger and bigger, and we're talking both global population, just the sheer volume of human beings on the planet, but also within specific communities. So a community might go from having been a tiny village at one point to becoming subsumed by the nearest city as it gets bigger and bigger and bigger, and that little village ends up as just a suburb of the city. So the sheer volume of people around you within your community gets bigger and bigger as population gets larger and larger, and part of that, of course, is a function of the Industrial Revolution impacting on agriculture. Increased food production means more people get to eat, means more people survive and reproduce. Improvements in medicine, again, people who might have died of a disease 100 years earlier can now survive with that disease, and so the population gets bigger and bigger from those kind of contributory factors. It will reach a point where there's just so many people around you, you don't know who half of them are. You couldn't possibly remember that many names. And there may be people you vaguely recognise, somebody you know you've sat next to on the bus a few months ago because they look familiar, but you don't really know who they are. You don't have a name for them. You don't quite know where they live. You don't know who they're married to, who their kids are, what their job is, or any of that. So that network of intimate knowledge dissipates and gets more and more challenged. Now, a reaction towards that in quite modern times, of course, is to form ghettoised cultures, where it's almost like those few streets or that little neighbourhood puts up a brick wall around itself and gets very, very insular, very tight-knit, becomes like an old-fashioned village, even though technically it's in the middle of a city. So people do react against that, but what Weber is describing, what von France is describing, is that sort of alienation of people from their surroundings, from their human surroundings. And having to move from a village to a city or a big town in search of work means that what you leave behind might be your cousins and your aunts and your uncles and your grandparents, but it's also the graveyards. So that you live in that village, you can go along to the churchyard and you know there's 10 generations of your relatives buried there, and you fully expect to be buried there yourself one day. And you become a network with the land itself. Your blood, your bones, your ancestors are there. You move to a city, well, you're going to die at some point, but where will you be buried? Probably not in the same graveyard that your previous 10 generations of relatives is buried in. You'll be dumped in the whatever graveyard is available in the city. So you're no longer connected to the land in that sense. You're working no longer in a field, you're now working in a factory. And whatever it is that you produce in the factory might be something you've got no use for yourself. So it's not that You grow the food in the field, and then you take some of it home, and some you sell on the market, and some you eat yourself and feed to your kids. Now you go to a factory and you manufacture something that you personally may have no use for and no interest in, but it's a job, pays the rent. That's what it's there for. So there is a disengagement there from the processes of production, in that it becomes more and more distanced. And as economies change, and we're getting into much more recent times, whereas perhaps 100 years ago you might have had somebody who would get a job at a factory and they'd be there for their entire adult working life. Nowadays, the nature of employment is such, of course, that people chop and change jobs frequently. I heard something on the radio the other day suggesting it was the average person changed jobs every 5 years, which I don't know how reliable that is as data, but just as a concept of the frequency with which people change jobs. So they're no longer even part of that sort of tight-knit working community, that you work with people and they come and they go. You come and you go. And so you don't have that network there either. So a very estranged way of modern living that's very different from that tight-knit community of the more rural past, pre-modernity. So we're kind of seeing a big shift. And one of the things that Weber argues is that any system of government, leadership or whatever you want to call it, has to manage its people. Now, whether we're talking the village squire in a very small community, or we're talking a president or a prime minister in a massive country, they have to manage people. That's part of their job. If you live in a small community, you are that village squire. Again, you probably know everybody pretty much by now. If you are the prime minister or the president of a country, you can't possibly know 60 million people or 100 million people or however many millions of people live in your country. They just become numbers. And that leader is only in a very abstract sense actually managing the people, because underneath them there is an entire army of bureaucrats who are needed to do all of the paperwork and the administration and run the army and run the health service and run education and run this and run that. It's all kind of boils down to a million anonymous people doing the actual day-to-day running, and they don't know half the people around them any more than you do, any more than the president or the prime minister does. So you end up managing numbers. And when you're managing numbers, it's very easy to forget that these are human beings with human lives, with hopes and fears and dreams and loves and hates and all the rest of it. They just become numbers on a page, a kind of a game-playing system of demographics. And within that context, Weber argues, not only do you start viewing other people as numbers, but you realise very rapidly that you yourself are just a number to everybody else. You're just a face on the train. You're just somebody who lives 3 streets over that no one really knows. And so you internalise it, you come to regard yourself in this very depersonalised fashion as just being a unit. Karl Marx bangs on and on and on about this being the result of capitalism, but Weber, I think, would argue that any system, capitalism, socialism, communism, any otherism, it's less the politics and it's more the sheer volume of human beings that reduces us to numbers. So part of that means we lose a sense of who we are. We lose our sense of humanity. We lose our sense of community. And part of humanity in a pre-modern society, pre-modern, old-fashioned, is that you fit in with a community. You are a brother, an uncle, a grandson, a husband, whatever you are. You are all of these identities. You are part of a network in a community. But as those communities break down and people move away, maybe they live 100, 1,000, who knows how many miles away from their blood relatives, those relationships become less and less relevant for defining our sense of who we are. And it raises a question for people like Weber, people like Jung, as to what will fill the void in terms of defining who we are. And we could get all terribly postmodern and say that clearly in the last few decades, people have got obsessed with their racial identities, their sexuality identities, their gender identities, all of these other various factors, as that provides them with their sense of who they are and their belonging. Things that would have meant next to nothing 300 years ago, but have suddenly become terribly, terribly significant to people. Is it, well, I mean, it's a matter of opinion, isn't it? Is this a good thing, a bad thing, or whatever? Have people simply traded one identity for another? Or are they a bit like people drowning in a river, clutching at straws, looking for identities in places that aren't really going to give them much of a sense of identity or anything worthwhile or meaningful in the long run? Different people will have different takes on the relevance of modern day, or postmodern maybe we should say, sources of identity. Linking this back into Jung, just in case you're thinking, what the hell is all of this got to do with Jung? Jung's idea of individuation, I think, sits into this concept in both constructive and maybe not quite so constructive fashions. In that the notion of the individual, you as a person by yourself, is pretty much a stance within modernity, because that pre-modern society, you are part of a family, you are part of a tribe, you are part of a village, you are not so much an individual as a participant in a collective, and your sense of who you are comes from that collective. It shapes who you are. As we move towards this mass industrialized, anonymous way of living, on the one hand we're losing all of that sense of collectivity, and on the other hand what we're being left with is, who am I when nobody else is around, or at least nobody else terribly important around? So when I don't have that tight-knit network of blood relatives and kinship networks and kith networks around, who am I? And on the downside, that's Weber's notion and the kind of ideas spoken about by Durkheim and people like that around the mental collapse that comes with isolationism, the kind of anomie that develops as people feel less and less connected and they feel adrift and they turn to drink and to drugs and to self-destructive behaviours and go off and join mad religious cults and do Lord knows what else in a bid to try and fit into something somewhere, or rip themselves to shreds in the process because they are too acutely aware that they don't fit into anything anywhere. They just feel totally adrift. That's the downside. The attempt to make that into a more positive thing, I'd argue, is Jung's grasp perhaps of individuation, that you can move towards positive expression of who you are as a person, and within individuation there is a more modern notion of identity. It's less about that collectivism of the past, of the village way of life, of the rural way of life. It's more you on your own, but trying to make a good thing of it rather than it being a source of suffering. So you individuate, you look within, you balance your anima and your animus and your shadow and your ego and all the rest of it, and you try to achieve a wholeness within that is in some senses, I suppose, reflective of the Christian notion of the individual soul, as each person has a soul, and that soul is worth saving and is important in the eyes of God. So that's a kind of precursor of modernity, the notion of the individual soul in this context, rather than the socially isolated individual necessarily, but it sort of foreshadows where it's going to go in a couple of thousand years down the line. But also maybe that sort of more Buddhist idea of personal development, meditation, reflecting on yourself, trying to become a better person and deal with your attachments and all the rest of it. So there's sort of different traditions coming into play here, perhaps shaping Jung's ideas, shaping wider ideas in society. Putting aside Weber's notion of bureaucracy, he's also arguing that a lot of this, going back to the Industrial Revolution, is a result of scientific development. new inventions, new machines, new approaches. But it's not just machine, machine, machine. It's also attitudes and outlooks and belief systems that go along with the ability to create those machines and invent the new industrial processes and all the rest of it, that gets people, and not just scientists themselves, but it sort of ripples out into the wider community to people who don't really understand much about science, but nonetheless pick up on the disseminating attitudes to view the world, from Weber's perspective, in increasingly rationalist, increasingly materialist fashions. And a downside of that, I mean, the upside is you get these amazing inventions and medical processes that save lives, and there's all sorts of fantastic inventions and so on. But the downside for Weber is the development of disenchantment, Entzauberung, as he writes in German, so he uses the German term. Entzauberung is where life becomes, well, drabber and drabber and drabber as the magic leaches out of it. That life is no longer this mysterious, mystical networks of not only all these kind of friendship networks and familial networks, but the ancestral networks. And not just the bodies in the graveyard, but the sense of ancestral presences beyond the grave watching over you. A network in a Christian sense of saints and angels and even demons and devils and so on. These magical beings that are around that make life wondrous and strange and mysterious. And obviously from a perhaps pre-Christian point of view, elemental beings and nature spirits and gods and goddesses and all manner of strange things that are around, hiding behind every rock, every river, every tree in the forest. There's something odd and strange and weird, and we are but one element in this vast network of oddity and strangeness and weirdness, which is at once terrifying at times if it's some big scary thing come to chew your face off, but also inspiring and wonderful and magical and exciting. Whereas it's almost a little bit like an episode of Scooby-Doo. There's a really stupid analogy. At the end of Scooby-Doo, when there's been ghosts and ghoulies and freaky things chasing the Fred and Velma and the rest of them around, and at the end, and they rip the rubber mask. Turns out to be a rubber mask, and they rip it off, and it's Sid, the groundsman or whatever he is, and it's all very human. It's all very boring as an explanation. It's not something supernatural. It's not something spooky and weird. It's just some bloke in a rubber mask. There you go. That's the solution. And kind of that's like Weber's sense of Entzauberung. That we used to think of life as this magical, wonderful, supernatural, strange, weird thing that was fascinating. And now it's all a bit, yeah. Because there's a bog standard explanation for everything, scientific explanation for everything, and from Weber's point of view, that is, well, does it have to be boring? Maybe not, but it's often delivered in a boring way. I suppose maybe you could say that's a fault of how science is taught rather than anything integral to science itself, maybe. And you've got counterpoint arguments coming from people like Richard Dawkins saying, no, science can be just as wonderful, just as enchanting, just as mysterious and fascinating as any amount of magic and mythology and legends if you approach it in the right state of mind. So not everyone regards science as this sort of dull as ditchwater thing that renders life humdrum. But you don't even have to get into that argument. You can just simply say that whether it's down to politics, whether it's down to economics, whether it's down to science, whether it's down to something else, that life has been rendered more and more routine, more and more dull, more and more predictable, and less engaging. That's perhaps in the least mystical terminology how we could think of Entzauberung as a problem. The solution to Entzauberung is to enchant or re-enchant the world, bring the magic back. And that, of course, is where Jung comes into it, in that a lot of what he's doing is identifying people's disengagement from life as being down to the feeling of life being very alienating and mechanistic and dull and so forth, and people feeling very alienated from within themselves, let alone in their interpersonal network of relationships. and that what's needed is to turn to mythology, to turn to legend, to turn to dreams, to turn to alchemy and the sort of the mystical significances of things that were terribly important in the past but had become much less important during the 19th, 20th centuries. And find the solution to life's problems in the magical and the mystical and the transcendental rather than in the humdrum day-to-day quotidian stuff. So it's kind of blending in, I think, reasonably nicely there, as where Jung is presenting his ideas as a counterpoint to modernity, not to chuck the scientific baby out with the bathwater and get rid of the innovations in medicine and all the rest of it, but to say there is a dark side to this, very Jungian. There is a dark side to everything, a shadow side to everything, and this shadow side is the kind of alienation of humanity, but also the in a sense really almost like the inflation of humanity to be the end all and be all of everything. So whilst the common day-to-day man or woman might not feel that they're the end all and be all of much of anything at all, the idea that humanity can resolve all of its own problems, it doesn't need to pray to the gods, it doesn't need to turn to anything bigger and grander outside itself, it just needs to use its noddle and come up with clever scientific explanations for every problem and clever scientific solutions for every issue. That science, a bit like Sam Harris, science is the end all and be all to everything that will solve every known problem. We don't need anything outside ourselves. Whereas Jung is arguing that we kind of do need something outside ourselves, because if we end up thinking that we are the gods rather than the gods are sort of out there and bigger and grander and more impressive and more magical than we are, we experience a severe ego imbalance that leads us down to some pretty grotty paths, and you get that kind of what should we say, slightly Frankenstein thing, where we're so in love with our ability to do things, clever things, that we often don't pause long enough to think, should we do them? We just kind of rush in with the excitement, I can do this, I can do that, I can do the other, and we do stuff that has horrendous fallout to it, without thinking. Just because you can doesn't mean you should. And maybe having a sense of things bigger than us, to whom we owe allegiance, puts a kind of braking mechanism, sort of, to get us to slow down and think, yes, I can do this, but would God, Zeus, Hecate, whoever, want me to do this? Would they approve? Do I need to consult with something bigger than me to understand and see where I fit in and see if it's right, see if it's... Obviously, that's not an argument everyone is going to be happy with and would consider perhaps nonsensical, but he's seeing it, I think, as the kind of the turning to the archetypal as helping to balance out personal ego by putting ourselves in the context of something much bigger. I suppose the something much bigger could be humanity itself, if you wanted to be terribly atheistic and rational. Could work, I don't know. Doesn't seem to work in practice, does it, very much? But I suppose it could work as a thing bigger than me as an isolated individual that I have to run things through before I rush off and do them, that I owe a duty of consultation with something outside of myself in order to achieve that degree of balance. Trying to wheedle back into a bit of Jungian relevance as well. We could say, and I think certainly Weber would have said if he'd been using that language from a Jungian point of view, that the growth in rationality, the growth in materialism, of dispensing with the mystical and the magical and seeing everything as terribly mechanistic, terribly straightforward, is perhaps reflective, if we're thinking of the four functions of the psyche and how sometimes one of them can become very, very strong to the detriment of everything else. It's the thinking function, the scientific mind, and the sensation function, which emphasizes the material over the spiritual, the rational over the emotive and empathic, that came into vogue. I mean, clearly not for every single individual, but en large, en masse, we've got a sort of social movement where large swathes of the planet went more into thinking mode, more into sensation mode, less and less into either intuitive mode or feeling mode. And as with anything where you go too far in one direction, there becomes an imbalance and there is a cost to that excess as gradually other factors kind of try and claw back balance. Jung's argument around clawing back balance is enantiodromia. The undeveloped self shouts out and tries to create circumstances through synchronicity so that the outer world starts to create a reflection of the inner world, and those inequalities that are needing to be given a bit more attention and developed up to counterbalance the swings and excesses. You could argue there's been a lot of very weird religious movements and cultic movements that have kicked off that put huge emphasis on the irrational and the bizarre and the peculiar. Maybe that's a kind of a counterbalance to the heavy emphasis on the thinking function, or rather, sorry, on the sensation function. And there have been political movements. A lot of identity politics, you could say, is very feeling function oriented. It's all about what I feel, what that person over there feels, rather than what someone thinks, rather than what can be materially demonstrated. It's rather, I feel this makes so-and-so thing makes me feel happy, therefore if you question it or take it away or challenge it in any way, you are making a personal attack on me by trying to denigrate the thing that makes me feel happy. And that, again, maybe could be considered a counterbalance to the overemphasis on the thinking function, that this sort of somewhat strange manifestation of the feeling function within Western society, at any rate, possibly Eastern society too. So that may be a factor coming into play there to contemplate. Another element of modernity that Weber and various other people have argued is the growth of grand narratives. That there were grand narratives before, but the kind of addition of new grand narratives, I suppose. So a grand narrative, lightning quick, is a story that is presented as explaining 99% of everything. A story that explains the entire known world and everything beyond it. So Christianity is a grand narrative. Islam is a grand narrative. Buddhism is a grand narrative. What we see in the development of modernity is an upsurge in non-religious grand narratives. As religious narratives get more and more questioned with the scientific mindset saying, well, can you prove there's angels? Can you prove there's a God? Can you prove this? Can you prove that? And then disbanding, or not disbanding, discarding things that cannot be held up to rationalist scrutiny, that new belief systems emerge in that. Communism, capitalism, socialism, various other political isms, fascism, etc., etc. Some of them last obviously a lot longer than others do. Some are a bit flash in the pan. Some of them continue on into the 21st century. And people have faith in their isms to explain the world, to explain human nature, to predict the way things are going to go in the future, to give them direction about what is the moral thing to do in so-and-so situation. So capitalists favour one set of moral guidelines, communists favour a different set of moral guidelines. They're treating their ism as a kind of de facto religion, in that it may not have the mystical elements, but it's providing the explanatory elements, the directive elements. It's sort of creating a degree of social bonding ish. Everyone rushing off to the January sales is maybe capitalism's great religious gathering. And of course, a lot of religious gatherings like Easter, like Christmas, have been swamped by materialist concerns. It's less about what you believe and it's more about what you purchased. Buying the food and buying the presents and buying the cards and buying the chocolate eggs and it's all about stuff, material stuff. So there are these kind of surrogate religions that have emerged in modernity. And postmodernism, the argument is those grand narratives then get ditched, just as the religious grand narratives got questioned and to an extent, at any rate, ditched. So a lot of the political grand narratives are questioned and to a large extent ditched. But postmodernism offers nothing to replace them with, which again, it's creating a void, and then the whole issue becomes what's going to fill the void. So that's maybe a topic for another time to think about as things shift and turn and change. So where Jung sits with these political grand narratives, you could do a Jungian analysis of communist imagery, capitalist imagery, whatever, and how the stories promoted within politics provide some degree of framework for archetypal thinking. But I strongly suspect that maybe if we were to dig Jung up and ask him, he'd be more inclined to question whether something that lacks the transcendent can ever truly fill the gap, and if it can't, then will it simply either mutate and gradually sort of on the sly become more and more transcendent when no one's looking, or will it just eventually crumble into dust because it cannot fill the gap no matter how hard it tries, and something that is transcendent either from the past will return and people will go back to getting very Christian or very, very Jewish or very Buddhist or whatever again, and it will become kind of a revived thing, or will we see brand new forms of transcendentalism as we all start worshipping the great Martian or whatever it is in the future becomes the replacement form of transcendentalism. I suspect he'd go more down that line than he would be all that interested in engaging in an archetypal analysis of the narratives of communism or capitalism or socialism or any otherism. But we could understand it as a grasping around for something to fill a void, something that seems more contemporary than the old stories, but perhaps lacking a true awareness of quite what it was that those old stories provided, so that when we grasp around to find a replacement, often we're finding replacements that don't really do the job because we don't fully understand what the job is. We were maybe so eager to chuck the bath water out that we forgot there was a baby in it, and we've not quite understood that the new bucket of bath water doesn't have a baby in it, and it doesn't meet the same needs that the old transcendental systems did. So I think that maybe there's an element of that going on there. I was thinking about making mention of Eisenstein's arguments around forms of culture, because it's a little bit of a hobby horse. I really like Eisenstein's ideas. She talks about the movements between oral culture, manuscript culture, print culture and electronic culture. But I think I'd end up banging on for another 40 odd minutes if I went down that route. But in modernity, I'll try and do a tiny little bit of this. In modernity, there is the shift from heavy reliance on oral and manuscript culture to the print culture, Caxton's printing press, and the massive impact that had on society in terms of mass literacy, mass dissemination of printed materials, books, pamphlets, early newspapers, all the other bits and bobs that were churned out on the printing press, and changes in how we understand truth. That the way you understand truth in an oral culture or a handwritten manuscript culture is different from the way you understand truth in a printed culture, where 10,000 copies of the Bible will be absolutely identical, in a manner that 10,000 handwritten copies on ink and manuscripts and so on will not be identical, because people make spelling mistakes and miss a word or whatever. There's kind of variations where things are hand copied. that you don't get when things are just churned out on a printing press, 1,000 a minute, and they're all identical. So we start to expect standardization of truth, and it leads to all sorts of changing. Some of them may be positive changes, some of them not so positive changes in how we understand what is true. And then if we get more towards the postmodern era with the birth of the internet, and we shift from heavy reliance on printed culture to very, very heavy reliance on electronic culture, emails and social media platforms and all the rest of it. Again, how that changes what we understand of truth, how it changes the way we communicate, the way we expect other people to communicate. It changes notions of who can access what information, what's in the public domain and what should be kept private, all of that. So lots of rippling changes and ideas that come about with technology. So again, it's that kind of Weberian idea around industrial revolutions and technology changes, and that has this huge impact on society and how we understand each other. But here, communication technology rather than farming equipment or factory equipment or whatever. Where Jung would come into that's what I'm less clear about in my own mind, and it's why I'm just kind of mentioning the whole print and electronic element without getting too heavily into the arguments. I mean, mythological culture, the whole kind of archetypal realm of myths and legends, is the product of oral society. And then the move towards manuscript society, as people started jotting things down on parchments and papyrus scrolls and all the rest of it. And the way people understood religious truths in an oral culture, or indeed in a manuscript culture, is different from how they understand religious truths in a print culture. So that maybe is something, I don't know if we should discuss that at the end of the month or leave that for a different day, possibly. But anyway, let's just leave that floating there for a little while, and I'll stop talking now. I've banged on quite enough. Hopefully that's a little bit of meat on the bone that will get us thinking and talking and debating the interlinking between Jung and modernity, and maybe to some extent postmodernity, and quite where we are as a society, global society in the 21st century. And we can pick up from there. But say, if you would like the link, do shout and I'll send it out. Thank you.